The architects of heavy metal sold millions of records, yet they faced catastrophic bankruptcy. Predatory contracts had reduced Black Sabbath to indentured servants. Paralyzed by massive debt, the band turned to industrial quantities of cocaine, triggering a severe chemical psychosis that permanently destroyed their brotherhood. To save their failing corporation from total liquidation, 3 desperate men executed a ruthless boardroom coup. They weaponized a severely alcoholic drummer, forcing him to terminate his own best friend. Ozzy Osbourne was not a tragic casualty of rock and roll. He was a financial liability clinically amputated to balance the ledgers. The exact environment that manufactured Black Sabbath explains how 4 men could conquer the world musically while losing everything financially. Black Sabbath was not born out of an artistic commune or a privileged art school. They were the direct product of Aston, a heavily industrialized, economically depressed district in Birmingham, England, following the end of the Second World War. In the late 1960s, Birmingham was defined by the relentless noise of sheet metal factories, abattoirs, and auto manufacturing plants. The air was thick with industrial smog. For a working-class youth in Aston, the socio-economic trajectory was strictly predetermined. You left school at 15, you went to work on a factory floor, you drank in the local pub to numb the physical exhaustion, and you stayed there until you died. There was no upward mobility. There was only the production line. Music was not viewed as a creative outlet. It was viewed as the only viable exit strategy. The 4 men who would become Black Sabbath, Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, Bill Ward, and Ozzy Osbourne, were united primarily by a desperate, driving need to escape the factories. Their individual psychological and physical profiles dictated the sound they would eventually create. They did not sit down and consciously decide to invent heavy metal. The sound was engineered out of physical limitation, environmental dread, and raw necessity. Tony Iommi, the guitarist and undisputed architect of the band's musical structure, literally bled for the sound. On his final scheduled day of work at a sheet metal factory, a heavy industrial press slammed down onto his right hand, severing the tips of his middle and ring fingers. For a left-handed guitarist who fretted the notes with his right hand, this was a career-ending injury. Told by doctors he would never play again, Iommi refused to accept the factory as his permanent fate. He engineered his own prosthetics, melting down plastic dish soap bottles, forming them into thimbles, and gluing pieces of leather to the ends for grip. Because the plastic thimbles lacked nerve endings, Iommi could not feel the guitar strings. Because bending standard strings caused excruciating pain to his damaged fingers, he was forced to drastically loosen the tension of his guitar strings, tuning the instrument down significantly. He had to hit the strings harder to generate a clear sound, relying on heavy distortion and power chords, rather than intricate, fast-paced blues picking. The signature, apocalyptic sound of heavy metal, the slow, crushing, detuned guitar riff, was not born from a desire to sound evil. It was a mechanical adaptation to a severe physical handicap. Geezer Butler translated the grim reality of the Cold War and the bleakness of his hometown into lyrical themes of political corruption and existential terror. Bill Ward anchored this dread with an aggressive, punishing drumming velocity. John Michael Osborne, a petty criminal with no formal musical training, provided the final element. Possessing a unique, piercing vocal frequency, Osbourne sounded like an air raid siren echoing through an industrial wasteland, cutting directly through the dense, muddy wall of sound generated by Iommi's detuned guitar. Naming themselves Black Sabbath, they utilized dissonant musical intervals to tap into a frequency of working-class anger that no other band was addressing. Their entry into the recording industry was incredibly swift and utterly devoid of protection. Between 1970 and 1971, they released 3 massive albums, Black Sabbath, Paranoid, and Master of Reality. They were suddenly headlining arenas across the globe, achieving platinum status and generating staggering amounts of capital. For the band, the transition from abject poverty to global fame was a jarring and disorienting psychological shock. They possessed immense sonic power, but they lacked the foundational financial literacy required to navigate the predatory landscape of the 1970s music business. This structural vulnerability opened the door for Patrick Meehan and his firm Worldwide Artists. Meehan recognized their profound naivety. They were 4 young men with minimal formal education, lacking any independent legal representation, and possessing a total ignorance of financial ledgers. Meehan presented himself as their savior. In return, the band signed contracts that essentially surrendered complete control over their revenue streams, their publishing rights, and their professional autonomy, placing their unquestioning trust in his authority. The strategy employed by Worldwide Artists to control the band was devastating in its clinical execution. It relied on 2 primary pillars: total information isolation and sheer physical exhaustion. First, Meehan established a strict information silo. The band was deliberately kept blind to their gross earnings, their contractual obligations, and the specific percentages being taken by management and the record labels. When Iommi or Butler would ask about royalties or tour grosses, they were met with complex jargon, vague reassurances, or outright dismissals. They were told to focus on the music and let management handle the business. The ledgers were closed to them. Instead of paying the band their actual earned percentages, management utilized a system of controlled allowances and strategic pacification. If a band member wanted a new car, Meehan would buy it for them. If they needed cash for a night out, a wad of banknotes was handed over. If they wanted a house, management would arrange the purchase. This created a powerful illusion of immense wealth. The band members felt rich because they were driving luxury vehicles and living in large properties. However, what they failed to realize was that these assets were often not registered in their names, and the cash handouts represented a microscopic fraction of the actual capital they were generating. They were not building personal equity. They were merely receiving a strictly controlled allowance from their own vast earnings. The second pillar of control was exhaustion. The most effective way to prevent a band from asking difficult financial questions is to keep them continuously moving. Between 1970 and 1973, Black Sabbath was subjected to an incredibly punishing schedule of touring and recording. They would finish a grueling multi-month tour of the United States, fly back to the United Kingdom, and be forced immediately into the recording studio to produce another album, only to be pushed back out on the road weeks later. This relentless cycle broke them down physically and mentally. They were chronically exhausted, suffering from sleep deprivation, and severed from the grounding reality of normal society. When you are waking up in a different city every single day, playing a deafening 2-hour concert, and boarding an airplane the next morning, you do not have the energy or the logistical capacity to hire an independent forensic accountant. The physical grind ensured their compliance. They were essentially running on a treadmill that powered a massive corporate machine, and management controlled the speed of the treadmill. The devastating collision between the illusion of their wealth and the reality of their bankruptcy occurred in 1972. Following the massive success of Master of Reality, the band decided to relocate to Los Angeles, California, to record their 4th studio album, appropriately titled Volume 4. To maintain the facade of extreme rock royalty, management rented a sprawling, opulent mansion in the exclusive Bel Air neighborhood for the band to live in during the recording process. The mansion belonged to John DuPont, an heir to the DuPont chemical fortune. It was a massive estate equipped with a ballroom, a pool, and expansive grounds. From the outside, it was the ultimate symbol of success. Black Sabbath was living in the same neighborhood as Hollywood elite and global billionaires. Yet, it was within the walls of this Bel Air mansion that the financial trap finally snapped shut, exposing the absolute hollowness of their situation. Despite living in a multi-million-dollar estate and having 3 platinum-selling albums in their catalog, the day-to-day reality of the band's liquidity was pathetic. A famous and revealing incident from this period perfectly encapsulates the absurdity of their exploitation. Ozzy Osbourne and Geezer Butler had gone out for an evening in Los Angeles. When it was time to return to the Bel Air mansion, they realized they did not have enough cash on them to pay for the taxi fare. These were the lead singer and the primary lyricist of one of the biggest bands on the planet. Their music was currently dominating the charts. They were generating millions of dollars in mechanical royalties and live performance fees. Yet they had to scramble and beg for spare change to cover a basic cab ride. They were forced to have the taxi driver wait outside the mansion while they went inside to search for loose dollar bills hidden in drawers and under sofa cushions. This incident was not an isolated clerical error. It was the precise moment the veil was lifted. The cognitive dissonance became impossible to ignore. How could they be the biggest heavy metal band in the world, living in a palace, yet lack the basic liquidity of a minimum wage factory worker back in Birmingham? Geezer Butler, who was generally the most perceptive and cynical member of the group, began to heavily scrutinize their situation. The questions that management had successfully deflected for 2 years suddenly became urgent and aggressive. Butler and Iommi demanded to see the books. They demanded an explanation for the missing millions. The answers they uncovered were horrifying. They realized that the contracts they had signed effectively surrendered their publishing rights, the most lucrative and long-term asset any songwriter can own. Every time a Black Sabbath song was played on the radio, purchased on vinyl, or licensed, the vast majority of the revenue bypassed the creators and flowed directly into the accounts of their management and publishing companies. They discovered that the costs of their massive tours, the flights, the equipment transport, the crew salaries, the luxury hotel suites, and even the exorbitant rent for the Bel Air mansion were being aggressively charged against the band's own royalties. Management was essentially using the band's own money to maintain the illusion of wealth, while taking a massive percentage off the top. Black Sabbath realized they were not millionaires. They were massively in debt. They were heavily compensated employees in a corporation where they held no actual equity, and their employer was systematically bleeding them dry. The psychological impact of this realization was utterly devastating. They had spent their entire youth fighting to escape the exploitation of the industrial factories, only to realize they had willingly walked into a far more sophisticated, vastly more expensive form of exploitation. They were not free. They were indentured servants to a piece of paper. The brotherhood they had forged in the damp rehearsal rooms of Birmingham was suddenly overshadowed by the looming threat of catastrophic financial ruin. The decision to break away from Patrick Meehan and Worldwide Artists was the only logical step for their survival, but it triggered a legal nightmare that would consume the band for years. Firing a powerful music manager in the 1970s was not a simple administrative task. It was a declaration of war. Meehan did not quietly relinquish his control over his most profitable asset. He retaliated with a barrage of complex, aggressive lawsuits. The legal battles were designed to freeze the band's assets, halt the payment of their remaining royalties, and drown them in exorbitant legal fees. This created a paralyzing paradox for the band. To fight the man who had stolen their money, they had to hire expensive London litigators. But they could not afford to pay the litigators because the manager they were suing was actively withholding their funds. They were legally trapped. During this period, the band members found themselves in situations that were humiliatingly disconnected from their public persona. While fans were buying tickets to see the Gods of Darkness perform in sold-out arenas, Tony Iommi and Geezer Butler were spending their days sitting in sterile law offices, reviewing dense legal documents they barely understood, and facing the terrifying prospect of losing their homes and their equipment. They were served with subpoenas outside of concert venues. The legal stress became a physical weight, crushing the joy out of the music they had created. The legal war with their former management effectively acted as a massive vacuum, sucking the creative energy and unity out of the band. They were no longer focused on writing groundbreaking heavy metal. They were focused on surviving depositions and avoiding bankruptcy. The focus shifted entirely from the fretboard to the balance sheet. The sheer terror of their financial vulnerability fundamentally altered the internal dynamics of Black Sabbath. The naivety that had united them was destroyed. In its place, a deep, pervasive anxiety took root. They realized that the world they had conquered was fundamentally rigged against them, and the men they had trusted to protect them were the ones holding the knife. Faced with mounting debts, frozen assets, and the horrifying prospect of returning to the poverty they had so desperately fought to escape, the band needed a coping mechanism. They needed a way to numb the terror of the lawsuits and the betrayal. The physical exhaustion of the tours had broken their bodies, but the financial betrayal had broken their minds. As the reality of their bloody balance sheet became undeniable during the fraught recording sessions of Volume 4 in Los Angeles, Black Sabbath did not seek professional financial counsel or psychological support. Instead, they sought refuge in the only resource they currently had unlimited access to. To escape the nightmare of the courtroom, they locked the doors of the Bel Air mansion, turned up the amplifiers, and began to systematically self-medicate on a scale that defies logical comprehension, setting the stage for a descent into narcotic paranoia that would permanently shatter their minds and their brotherhood. The discovery of their catastrophic financial exploitation during the early stages of the Volumers. 4 sessions in 1972 did not prompt Black Sabbath to halt production or rationally restructure their business. They were locked into contractual delivery schedules, and stopping meant admitting defeat to the management team actively attempting to ruin them. The pressure was suffocating. The band was isolated in Los Angeles, surrounded by the superficial wealth of the Bel Air mansion, yet acutely aware they were essentially bankrupt and facing years of vicious litigation. The psychological terror of this realization required an immediate, powerful anesthetic. They did not find solace in the music. The music had become the very mechanism of their exploitation. Instead, they found their escape in a substance that offered an instantaneous aggressive surge of false confidence and numbness: cocaine. The transition from recreational drug use to severe systemic addiction within Black Sabbath occurred with terrifying speed. In the early days in Birmingham, and during the recording of their first 2 albums, their substances of choice were marijuana and alcohol, depressants that generally mellowed the atmosphere and aligned with the heavy, sluggish tempo of their music. But the legal nightmare and the exhaustion of endless touring required a different chemical intervention. Cocaine is a powerful central nervous system stimulant. It provides a massive artificial spike in dopamine, creating a temporary illusion of invincibility, hyperfocus, and absolute control. For a band that had just realized they controlled absolutely nothing in their professional lives, cocaine was the perfect, fatal remedy. The volume of cocaine consumed during the Volner 4 sessions at the record plant in Los Angeles is legendary, but the reality behind the legend is grim and clinical. The figures provide the clearest, most objective metric of their deterioration. According to verified accounts from both the band members and the studio engineers, the budget allocated for recording the actual album was approximately $60,000. The budget spent on purchasing cocaine during those same sessions exceeded $75,000. They were spending more capital on narcotics than they were on the production of their own art. The logistics of maintaining this level of consumption became a primary operational focus for the band. Cocaine was not purchased in small, casual amounts. It was acquired in massive quantities. They utilized private couriers to fly the drugs in from specialized suppliers. The cocaine was smuggled into the record plant, hidden inside hollowed-out speaker cabinets and flight cases, bypassing the basic security of the studio environment. The recording console, the amplifiers, and the mixing desks were frequently covered in a layer of white powder. This was not a party. This was a sustained, desperate attempt to chemically medicate severe anxiety. The biological impact of consuming tens of thousands of dollars worth of pure cocaine over a period of months is absolute. While the drug initially provided the energy required to work through the exhaustion and the legal stress, the inevitable neurological backlash was devastating. Prolonged heavy cocaine use severely depletes the brain's dopamine receptors and violently disrupts the central nervous system. The false confidence quickly burns off, leaving behind a profound, inescapable state of extreme paranoia, agitation, and psychosis. The environment inside the record plant mutated into a hostile state. The recording studio, which should function as a collaborative sanctuary for musicians, transformed into a hostile, terrifying bunker. The air was physically heavy with suspicion. The four men whose brotherhood had survived the slums of Birmingham suddenly stopped trusting each other. The paranoia manifested in disturbing, often violent, physical reactions. The band members became convinced that the studio was bugged by their former management team, Patrick Meehan and Worldwide Artistes. They believed Meehan was hiring private investigators to spy on them, attempting to gather evidence to use against them in the ongoing multi-million-dollar lawsuits. They were terrified that the police or federal agents were preparing to raid the Bel Air mansion or the record plant at any moment. This fear possessed a basis in reality, given the staggering quantity of illegal narcotics they possessed, but the cocaine magnified the threat to a level of acute clinical delusion. Every shadow became an informant. Every click on a phone line was a wiretap. This atmosphere of absolute terror led to an escalation that permanently poisoned the dynamic of the band. To defend themselves against these perceived and sometimes real threats, the members of Black Sabbath began to arm themselves. They were no longer just musicians carrying guitars and drumsticks. They were paranoid addicts carrying concealed lethal weapons. Accounts from the era confirmed that band members, particularly Tony Iommi and Geezer Butler, began bringing handguns and rifles into the recording studio and the Bel Air mansion. The Bel Air estate, intended to be a luxurious creative retreat, was treated like a fortified compound under siege. The presence of firearms in an enclosed environment saturated with high-grade cocaine and severe emotional volatility created a situation of extreme, constant danger. They were heavily armed, severely sleep-deprived, and experiencing chemically induced psychosis. The presence of firearms in an enclosed environment saturated with high-grade cocaine and severe emotional volatility created a situation of extreme constant danger. Four of the most famous musicians in the world stalked through the corridors of a Los Angeles estate with loaded weapons, their minds so distorted by narcotics that they could no longer distinguish between a physical threat and a chemical hallucination. The paranoia fundamentally destroyed the creative process. Music requires communication, vulnerability, and trust. Cocaine destroys all three. The recording sessions for Volume 4 became excruciatingly difficult. The band would stay awake for days at a time, locked in the studio, obsessed with microscopic details of the mix, or paralyzed by the fear that someone was listening to them. Communication broke down into aggressive arguments or sullen, suspicious silence. Ozzy Osbourne, in particular, was severely impacted by this environment. While Iommi and Butler reacted to the paranoia by arming themselves and attempting to exert control, Osbourne retreated inward. The drugs amplified his underlying depression and insecurity. He felt increasingly alienated from the musical direction Iommi was taking, but he was too chemically compromised to articulate his frustrations effectively. His vocal performances suffered, and his unreliability became a massive point of friction. Bill Ward, the drummer, attempted to maintain the rhythm amidst the chaos, but he too was sinking deeply into substance abuse, relying heavily on alcohol to counteract the extreme anxiety generated by the cocaine and the legal threats. Despite the catastrophic psychological environment, Black Sabbath managed to complete Volume 4. The album is a testament to their sheer musical resilience, a heavy, uncompromising record that contains some of their most iconic tracks, including Supernaut and the haunting ballad Changes. Tellingly, one of the most prominent tracks on the album is titled Snowblind, a blatant, unapologetic anthem dedicated entirely to cocaine. The drug had become so central to their existence that it was now the primary subject of their art. The record company, terrified of the legal implications, forced the band to change the name of the album from Snowblind to Volume 4, but the damage was done. The chemical dependency was now permanently etched into their legacy. When Volume 4 was released in September 1972, it was a massive commercial success, quickly reaching the top 10 in the UK and achieving platinum status in the United States. To the outside world, the Black Sabbath machine was stronger than ever. The heavy riffs were intact, the stage shows were massive, and the money continued to flow. But the success was an illusion masking a terminal decline. The money generated by Volume 4 did not go toward securing their future. It went toward funding the ongoing ruinous lawsuits against Patrick Meehan and fueling the ever-expanding cocaine budget. The recording of Volume 4 marked the definitive end of the original Black Sabbath Brotherhood. The four men who walked out of the record plant were not the same men who had walked into Regent Sound Studios just 2 years earlier. The shared poverty and common goal that had united them in Birmingham had been obliterated. The cocaine had chemically rewired their brains, replacing trust with profound suspicion and replacing creative joy with a desperate, grinding anxiety. They were heavily armed, deeply indebted and terrified of each other. The psychological rot had set in. The band was no longer a collaborative unit. It was a failing corporation. And as the 1970s progressed, the financial pressure and the chemical damage would require someone to seize absolute dictatorial control to prevent total collapse. The Brotherhood was dead. The legal severance from Patrick Meehan and Worldwide Artists did not liberate Black Sabbath. It plunged them into an administrative and financial void. By the mid-1970s, the band had successfully severed ties with the management that was draining their accounts, but in doing so, they inherited a labyrinth of litigation. Former managers, aggressive creditors, and the British tax authorities were all circling the remaining assets of the band. The millions of dollars they had supposedly earned were tied up in court injunctions and frozen accounts. In the modern music industry, a band in this crisis would immediately hire an independent phalanx of forensic accountants, crisis managers, and specialized entertainment lawyers. Black Sabbath did not have the capital, the industry connections, or the basic knowledge to execute such a maneuver. They were completely exposed. The infrastructure that had booked their flights, paid their studio times, and shielded them from the operational realities of the music business was gone. If the band stopped working, the revenue stream would instantly dry up and the lawsuits would force them into total bankruptcy. The machine had to be kept running, Someone had to seize the controls. That responsibility fell squarely onto the shoulders of the band's lead guitarist and primary composer, Tony Iommi. Iommi's assumption of power was not a hostile, ego-driven coup. It was an absolute necessity for survival. Among the four members, Iommi was the only one possessing the psychological constitution required to face the bureaucratic nightmare. Geezer Butler, the lyricist, was sinking into severe introversion and battling his own struggles with depression. Bill Ward, the drummer, was rapidly succumbing to severe alcoholism, using liquor to numb himself against the legal stress. Ozzy Osbourne was structurally detached from the musical composition process and was beginning a steep, terrifying descent into chemical dependency that rendered him highly unreliable. Iommi stepped into the leadership vacuum. The man who had engineered his own prosthetic fingertips to overcome a factory injury applied that same grim, relentless pragmatism to the business of Black Sabbath. He became the de facto manager, the primary legal liaison, the financial overseer, and the exclusive producer of their records. This transition permanently altered the internal ecosystem of the band. During their formative years in Birmingham and throughout the recording of their first 3 albums, Black Sabbath operated as a crude but functioning democracy. Decisions were made collectively. The music was born out of organic 4-way jamming in rehearsal rooms, under the crushing weight of their debts and legal threats. That democracy was suspended. Iommi imposed a strict authoritarian regime. The recording of their 6th studio album, aptly titled Sabotage, released in 1975, stands as the starkest documentation of this era. The title was a literal reflection of their reality. The band felt they were being actively sabotaged by their former management and the legal system. The recording sessions at Morgan Studios in London were frequently interrupted by process servers handing the band members subpoenas and legal writs directly across the mixing console. To combat this, Iommi enforced a grueling work ethic. Music was no longer an artistic exploration. It was a mechanism for debt repayment. Iommi demanded perfection, working obsessive marathon hours in the studio to produce the album himself because the band could not afford, nor did they trust outside producers. He would stay awake for days, fueled by cocaine, layering complex guitar tracks and meticulously managing the soundboards. This intense micromanagement bred deep resentment. Iommi viewed his strict discipline as the only thing keeping the band out of prison or bankruptcy. The other 3 members, however, began to view Iommi not as a savior, but as a tyrant. He dictated the rehearsal schedules. He dictated the musical direction. The collaborative brotherhood was dead, replaced by a rigid hierarchy where Iommi was the employer, and the others were rapidly feeling like exhausted, underpaid employees. The friction was most severe between Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne. Their fundamental approaches to music and survival were diametrically opposed. Iommi, carrying the immense pressure of the band's survival, sought to evolve their sound. He began introducing string arrangements, synthesizers, and complex progressive rock song structures, attempting to mature the band's output and maintain their commercial viability in a changing musical landscape. Osbourne possessed zero interest in musical evolution. He lacked the technical ability to understand Iommi's complex arrangements. Osbourne was a primal frontman who relied solely on heavy, simplistic blues-based riffs to anchor his vocal melodies. As Iommi's compositions became more intricate, Osbourne found it increasingly difficult to find his vocal space. He felt alienated by the music he was being forced to sing. This creative alienation was compounded by a severe personal tragedy. In 1977, Osbourne's father, Jack, passed away. His father had been a massive source of support, the man who had bought Ozzy his first PA system when he had nothing. The death devastated Osbourne. Already consumed by resentment toward the dictatorial environment of the band and struggling to cope with the endless touring schedule, Osbourne suffered a psychological collapse. His drug and alcohol consumption escalated from chronic to critical. In late 1977, unable to cope with his grief and his growing hatred for the band's operational structure, Osbourne's reliability collapsed entirely. During the recording sessions for their 8th studio album, Never Say Die, the machine finally broke down. Osbourne lacked the fundamental cognitive capacity to contribute to the new writing process. His depression and substance abuse had neutralized his creative drive. He routinely failed to show up for rehearsals, and when he did arrive, he was too intoxicated to perform. He spent the vast majority of his time actively avoiding his bandmates and his professional obligations. For Tony Iommi, the situation had shifted from a personal annoyance to an existential corporate threat. They were bleeding cash. They owed the record label a completed album, and the record label was the only entity currently advancing them money to pay their lawyers and their taxes. They could not afford to sit in a Canadian studio for months while their lead singer refused to work. Iommi looked at the operational reality of Black Sabbath. He analyzed the data. He was writing all the music. He was producing the records. Geezer Butler was writing all the lyrics. Bill Ward was playing the drums. Ozzy Osbourne was contributing nothing to the creation of the product. Yet he was consuming a quarter of the remaining fiercely contested revenue, and his unreliability was actively preventing the product from being finished. In the pressurized, debt-ridden environment of 1979, sentimentality was a luxury they could not afford. The shared history of Aston, the early struggles in the clubs, and the creation of heavy metal no longer mattered. Black Sabbath was a failing business, and Iommi was the CEO forced to make a brutal operational cut. Iommi initiated the process of terminating Ozzy Osbourne. He did not make this decision in a fit of rage. It was a cold, calculated, and ruthlessly methodical consensus-building process. Iommi knew that he could not unilaterally fire the frontman. He needed the backing of the other two members to make the termination legally and operationally binding. Behind Osbourne's back, a series of secret meetings were convened. Iommi approached Geezer Butler and Bill Ward. The arguments presented were strictly logical and rooted in survival. Iommi laid out the facts. Osbourne was functionally incapacitated. He was refusing to sing. He suffered from severe clinical depression. His drug use was unmanageable. If they did not deliver a functioning album and execute a successful, financially critical tour, the band would be completely liquidated by their creditors. The creditors would seize their homes, their equipment, and their remaining publishing rights. Geezer Butler, who had written the lyrics Osbourne sang for a decade, agreed with Iommi's assessment. Butler saw that Osbourne was miserable and recognized that his presence was destroying the band's ability to function. The most difficult component of this secret tribunal was Bill Ward. Ward and Osbourne were incredibly close. They shared a deep personal bond that predated the formation of the band. They were drinking partners and confidants, but Ward was also heavily reliant on the Black Sabbath income, and his own severe alcoholism rendered him exceptionally compliant to Iommi's stronger personality. Faced with the stark reality of financial ruin, Ward capitulated. He agreed that for the band to survive, his best friend had to be removed. The ultimate betrayal was not born of malice, it was born of desperate self-preservation. The three instrumentalists of Black Sabbath formed a coalition against their singer. They finalized the decision in private, bypassing Osbourne to prevent any immediate confrontation or disruption to the final stages of their touring obligations. They agreed that as soon as the Never Say Die tour concluded, Osbourne would be officially removed from the corporation. The verdict was sealed. The man who had provided the defining voice of the heavy metal genre, the man who had stood with them in the freezing rehearsal rooms of Birmingham 10 years prior, was now officially classified as a redundant liability. The only thing left to do was execute the termination, a task that Iommi, displaying a ruthless level of psychological detachment, would ensure was as agonizing as possible. The decision to terminate Ozzy Osbourne had been ratified in secret by the three remaining members of Black Sabbath. The operational logic was irrefutable. The band was drowning in debt. The singer was functionally incapacitated by addiction and depression, and his continued presence guaranteed their collective financial ruin. But corporate decisions are executed by human beings, and the manner in which this specific termination was handled reveals an unsettling truth about the absolute decay of their interpersonal relationships. The execution of Ozzy Osbourne was not a clean break. It was an act of profound psychological cruelty, orchestrated primarily by Tony Iommi's desire to avoid direct conflict, and inflicted heavily upon the band's most vulnerable member. In early 1979, Black Sabbath was holed up in a rented house in Los Angeles, ostensibly attempting to write material for a new album following the disastrous Never Say Die tour. The environment was stagnant. Osbourne was largely absent, retreating to his own hotel room or local bars, sinking deeper into a catastrophic cycle of alcohol and cocaine abuse. He was severed from the band's operational reality. He had no idea the tribunal had already ruled against him. Tony Iommi, acting as the de facto CEO, had already begun making contingency plans. He had quietly met with Ronnie James Dio, the powerhouse vocalist who had recently left Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow. Iommi recognized that Dio possessed the technical capability, the aggressive work ethic, and the sobriety necessary to rebuild the Black Sabbath machine. The replacement was secured before the incumbent was even notified. The logistical challenge was delivering the news. Firing the frontman of a massive rock band is a volatile action. Given the extreme chemical volatility of everyone involved, a direct confrontation carried a high risk of physical violence. Iommi, the architect of the band's survival and the instigator of the firing, flatly refused to do it himself. He did not call a band meeting. He did not sit Osbourne down to explain the financial and operational realities that necessitated the change. Iommi completely detached himself from the human element of the transaction. Instead, he delegated the responsibility. He assigned the task to Bill Ward. The toxicity of this directive directly weaponized the specific dynamic between Bill Ward and Ozzy Osbourne. They were not merely co-workers, they were the closest of friends. Their bond predated the formation of Black Sabbath. They had played together in earlier struggling bands in Birmingham. They shared the same working-class anxieties and the same destructive coping mechanisms. Ward was Osbourne's primary confidant within the highly pressurized ecosystem of the band. Iommi, supported by Geezer Butler, essentially forced Ward into an impossible moral corner. The ultimatum was unstated but entirely clear. If Ward did not execute the firing, the band would collapse and Ward would lose his sole source of income and his entire identity as a musician. Iommi leveraged Ward's loyalty to the survival of the band against his loyalty to his best friend. By forcing Ward to deliver the news, Iommi avoided the immediate confrontation and simultaneously shattered the only remaining alliance within the band. It was a brutally effective predatory management tactic. The execution took place on April 27, 1979. The setting was not a boardroom or a lawyer's office. It was the bleak, sterile hallway of the Le Parc Suite Hotel in West Hollywood. Bill Ward, heavily burdened by guilt and visibly struggling with his own severe alcohol dependency, was dispatched to Osbourne's hotel room. He carried the official termination notice. The interaction was brief, awkward, and devastating. Ward knocked on the door. When Osbourne answered, likely nursing a severe hangover, Ward did not offer a long, emotional explanation. The tension and the guilt were too immense for a nuanced conversation. Ward simply handed Osbourne the paperwork and delivered the core message. The band had decided to move on without him. He was out. Osbourne's reaction was not explosive anger. It was absolute, paralyzing shock. He had assumed that his erratic behavior was a protected privilege of his status as the frontman. He believed the brotherhood forged in Aston was an impenetrable shield. Standing in that hotel hallway, looking at his best friend holding his termination papers, the reality of his expendability crashed down upon him. The betrayal he experienced shattered his remaining psychological defenses. He was not furious at Iommi because he expected clinical ruthlessness from him. He was broken by the stark fact that Bill Ward, his drinking partner and his closest ally, had been the one to pull the trigger on his career. The psychological violence of having your best friend act as your executioner is a specific kind of trauma. Ward immediately retreated from the hotel room, returning to Iommi and Butler to report that the task was complete. The deed was done. The corporate entity of Black Sabbath had successfully excised its problematic asset. The immediate aftermath for Ozzy Osbourne was catastrophic. The firing removed the only structural framework that had governed his life for a decade. He was suddenly an unemployed high school dropout with a severe substance abuse problem, stranded in Los Angeles, millions of miles away from his roots in the UK. He retreated into total isolation. Osbourne locked himself inside his room at the Le Parc Suite Hotel for approximately 3 months. During this period, he engaged in a level of self-destruction that nearly killed him. He severed contact with the outside world. He did not bathe. He did not eat solid food. His daily intake consisted almost entirely of massive quantities of cocaine and alcohol. He kept the curtains drawn, sustaining a state of total chemical dependency. Osbourne was actively attempting to drink himself to death. The defining characteristic of his depression during this period was a profound sense of worthlessness. The men he had considered brothers had collectively decided that a piece of paper and a new singer were more valuable than his life. The rejection confirmed every deep-seated insecurity he possessed. He believed his career was finished beyond repair, that the voice of Black Sabbath was permanently silenced, and that he was nothing more than a discarded liability. He was a man waiting to die in a rented room. He was eventually pulled from the brink not by an intervention from his former bandmates, but by Sharon Arden, who would later become Sharon Osbourne, the daughter of the notorious music manager Don Arden. Sharon possessed the aggressive business acumen that Osbourne lacked from the beginning. She recognized his solo potential, physically dragged him out of the hotel room, forced him to sober up just enough to function, and began the arduous process of rebuilding him as a solo artist. But the psychological damage inflicted in that hotel hallway was permanent. The firing created a deep, festering wound that would define the narrative of heavy metal for the next 4 decades. While Osbourne was fighting for his life in a dark hotel room, the remaining members of Black Sabbath immediately moved forward with clinical efficiency. Ronnie James Dio was officially brought in. The band entered Criteria Studios in Miami to record their 9th album, Heaven and Hell. The album was a massive commercial and critical success. Dio's powerful operatic vocals and professional work ethic revitalized the band's sound. The album sold millions of copies and re-established Black Sabbath as a dominant force in the hard rock landscape. From a purely business perspective, Tony Iommi's brutal calculation proved correct. The amputation saved the patient, the debt could be serviced, the tours could resume. However, the success of Heaven and Hell did not erase the psychological toll of the execution. The betrayal fundamentally poisoned the atmosphere of the band, leaving behind a legacy of guilt, resentment, and profound alienation that no amount of record sales could cure. The empire survived, but the humanity of the men who built it was corrupted beyond recovery. The final act of this tragedy is not the firing itself, but the long, rotting aftermath endured by the men who survived the purge. The commercial triumph of Heaven and Hell in 1980 validated Tony Iommi's ruthless corporate restructuring. With Ronnie James Dio on vocals, Black Sabbath proved they could exist and generate massive revenue without Ozzy Osbourne. They sold millions of records, sold out arenas across the globe, and appeased their creditors. From the perspective of the accountants and the record executives, the amputation of their founding frontman was a flawless operational success. However, a balance sheet does not measure psychological attrition. The firing of Osbourne was a tactical victory that inflicted a fatal moral wound on the remaining founders. The decades that followed the 1979 purge serve as a prolonged clinical study of the diagnoses that occur when a creative brotherhood is permanently replaced by a sterile, obligation-driven business apparatus. The heavy metal empire survived, but the men who built it were forced to maintain its operational weight through a period of sustained internal decay. The most immediate and tragic casualty of the betrayal was Bill Ward. The drummer had been coerced into delivering the termination notice to his best friend, an act that fractured his psychological stability beyond repair. Ward was already suffering from severe alcoholism, but the guilt of his compliance accelerated his addiction to a critical, life-threatening level. During the subsequent Heaven and Hell tour, Ward's physical and mental deterioration became impossible to manage. He was playing the largest shows of his career, yet he was fundamentally absent. Ward later admitted in interviews that he was drinking so heavily during this period that he possesses zero recollection of performing on the Heaven and Hell album or playing the accompanying tour dates. His brain simply stopped recording memories. He was operating on pure, alcohol-soaked muscle memory. The pressure of maintaining the new, highly professional standards set by Dio, combined with his crushing internal guilt, finally broke him. In August 1980, right in the middle of a massive American tour, Bill Ward suffered a severe panic attack. He walked off the tour bus in Colorado, called the band's management, quit Black Sabbath, and disappeared. He abandoned the empire he helped build because the environment had become toxic to his basic survival. The man who was forced to fire his best friend became the next casualty of the machine. With Ward gone, the original rhythmic foundation of Black Sabbath was destroyed. Geezer Butler, the band's primary lyricist and ideological compass, also found himself increasingly alienated. Without Osbourne to sing his words and with the band's dynamic shifting heavily under the influence of new members, Butler's interest waned. He would leave the band, return out of financial necessity, and leave again multiple times over the next 2 decades. He became a transient employee within his own company. This left Tony Iommi isolated at the helm. The burden of leadership that Iommi had assumed to save the band from bankruptcy in the 1970s transformed into a permanent, inescapable prison in the 1980s and 1990s. Iommi became the sole custodian of the Black Sabbath brand. The brand, however, no longer belonged exclusively to him. It belonged to the record labels and the promoters who demanded a constant stream of product. Iommi's subsequent career became an exhausting exercise in brand maintenance. He was forced to keep the Black Sabbath name alive to service ongoing financial obligations and sustain his livelihood. This necessity resulted in a revolving door of musicians. Over the next 15 years, Black Sabbath became a chaotic franchise rather than a cohesive band. Iommi hired and fired a dizzying array of vocalists, a roster including Ian Gillan from Deep Purple, Glenn Hughes, Tony Martin, and Ray Gillan. Bassists and drummers were swapped out continually. The band's output became wildly inconsistent. The most glaring proof of Iommi's lack of autonomy occurred in 1986. Exhausted by the Black Sabbath legacy, Iommi recorded a solo album featuring Glenn Hughes on vocals. He intended to release it simply under the name Tony Iommi. However, his record label, Warner Brothers, and his management flatly refused. They understood that a Tony Iommi solo record would sell a fraction of the units that a Black Sabbath record would. They forced Iommi to release the album under the bizarre, compromised title Black Sabbath, featuring Tony Iommi. The architect of heavy metal was not legally permitted to use his own name. He was permanently shackled to the corporate entity he had created. While Iommi was struggling to keep the Sabbath brand relevant through a decade of shifting lineups and declining record sales, the man he had ruthlessly fired was executing the most unexpected and massively profitable revenge in rock history. Ozzy Osbourne did not die in that West Hollywood hotel room. Under the aggressive, hyper-competent management of Sharon Arden, who would soon become his wife, Osbourne was rebuilt into a massive commercial juggernaut. Sharon recognized that the Black Sabbath management had treated Osbourne as a disposable asset. She ensured that in his solo career, Osbourne was the undisputed center of the enterprise. Supported by the phenomenal guitar work of Randy Rhoads, Osbourne released Blizzard of Oz in 1980 and Diary of a Madman in 1981. These albums were colossal commercial triumphs, far outselling the contemporary output of the Dio-led Black Sabbath. The power dynamic inverted. The liability that Iommi had cut loose became a multi-platinum stadium headliner, while the remaining Black Sabbath struggled to fill mid-sized theaters. A bitter, highly publicized war of words erupted in the music press. Osbourne, fueled by lingering trauma and spite, took every opportunity to mock his former bandmates. At one point during a solo tour, Osbourne reportedly hired a dwarf to come on stage, named him Ronnie, and publicly humiliated him as a direct insult to Ronnie James Dio. It was petty, vicious, and a clear demonstration of the deep animosity that had replaced their former brotherhood. The irony was absolute. Iommi had fired Osbourne to save the business, but Osbourne ended up building a far more profitable business entirely on his own. The amputation survived better than the main body. As the decades progressed, the sheer financial gravity of the original Black Sabbath lineup made a reunion inevitable. However, these reunions were never the product of emotional reconciliation. They were calculated corporate mergers dictated by market demand. The first attempt occurred at the Live Aid concert in 1985. It was a disaster. The four original members, who had barely spoken in years, were thrown onto a stage in Philadelphia with minimal rehearsal. They were visibly uncomfortable, technically sloppy, and the tension was palpable. It was a stark visual representation of their broken relationship. It was not until 1997 that a formal touring reunion of the original four members was executed, largely orchestrated by Sharon Osbourne to co-headline her monumentally successful Ozfest tour. The tours were massively profitable, generating tens of millions of dollars. But the internal dynamic was fundamentally altered. Black Sabbath was no longer a democracy of four working-class men. It was a joint venture between the Tony Iommi camp and the strict corporate apparatus of the Osbourne family. The contracts were heavily negotiated. The interactions were managed by lawyers and representatives. They traveled on separate buses, stayed in separate hotel suites, and interacted primarily on stage. The brotherhood remained dead. They were simply executing a highly lucrative contract. The ultimate definitive proof that the corporate rot had entirely consumed the soul of Black Sabbath occurred during their final chapter. In 2011, the original four members announced they were reuniting to record a new studio album, 13, and embark on a massive global farewell tour. For the fans, it was marketed as the ultimate closure, a final ride for the founding fathers of heavy metal. But behind closed doors, the machinery of corporate greed struck one final time, perfectly echoing the Patrick Meehan era of the 1970s. Shortly after the press conference announcing the reunion, Bill Ward released a public statement declaring that he was withdrawing from the project. His reasoning was not physical inability, though his health was frequently cited by the Osbourne camp as an excuse. Ward stated he was withdrawing because he had been presented with an unsignable contract. Ward, a founding member who owned a 25% stake in the original corporation, was reportedly offered a contract that severely marginalized his financial participation and his legal status within the reunion entity. The specific details of the contract remain sealed, but Ward described it as fundamentally disrespectful, stripping him of his equal standing. The management teams representing Osbourne, Iommi, and Butler did not attempt to renegotiate or accommodate the drummer who had been with them since the slums of Aston. Operating with the same cold corporate efficiency that defined the 1979 firing of Ozzy, they simply moved on without him. They hired a session drummer, Brad Wilk of Rage Against the Machine, to record the album, and another session drummer, Tommy Clufetos, to play the farewell tour. Black Sabbath's final historic tour, dubbed The End, concluded in their hometown of Birmingham in February 2017. They played to a sold-out arena, generating massive final revenue. Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Ozzy Osbourne took their final bows to thunderous applause. But Bill Ward was not there. The man who provided the heartbeat of heavy metal was sitting at home, cut out of the final payday and the historical closure of his own band because of a contract dispute. This is the definitive, unromantic reality of Black Sabbath. The narrative comes full circle. In 1974, naive youths were exploited by ruthless managers who used contracts to steal their wealth. 40 years later, the surviving members utilized the exact same corporate mechanisms, lawyers, unequal contracts, and ruthless exclusion, to freeze out one of their own founding brothers. They had survived the industry, but they had absorbed its worst traits. The legacy of Black Sabbath is a permanent paradox. The music they created between 1970 and 1978 is unassailable. They forged the architecture of heavy metal out of industrial noise, physical handicap, and working-class dread. They provided a voice for the alienated and the disenfranchised. The riffs recorded in those early sessions will outlive everyone involved. But the human story of Black Sabbath is a clinical tragedy of exploitation. It is a detailed map of how rapid, unmanaged wealth and severe narcotic addiction can dismantle human empathy piece by piece. The Prince of Darkness and the Godfathers of Metal were not supernatural entities. They were fragile men who were chewed up by a predatory industry, turned against each other by paranoia, and ultimately reduced to isolated business entities operating under a shared logo. They sold tens of millions of records and conquered the globe, but the cost of that conquest was the permanent destruction of the brotherhood that started it.